Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me today for Sundays at Home. My name is Emma, and I'm the Associate Educator of Digital Learning and Innovation at the National Women's History Museum, and I will be your host today. A few housekeeping notes. Professor Nunley will be answering questions at the end of her program. You are welcome to ask your questions at any time during the program by using the Q&A function on the toolbar. You may ask your questions at any time during the presentation, but we will primarily answer them at the end. And Professor Nunley is happy to answer any of your questions, so please use the Q&A. And with that, I would like to introduce our guest and our moderator for today's program. Tamika Nunley is Associate Professor of History and the Sandler Family Faculty Fellow of American Studies at Cornell University. Along with articles, essays, and reviews, she's the author of At the Threshold of Liberty, Women, Slavery, and Shifting Identities in Washington, D.C., which received the Letitia Woods Brown Memorial Book Award, Pauli Murray Book Prize, and the Mary Kelly Book Prize, and it is also the subject of our conversation today. Her article, Thrice Condemned Enslaved Women, Violence and the Practice of Leniency in Antebellum Courts, received the Letitia Woods Brown Prize for Best Article in African American Women's History and the Anne Braden Prize for Best Article in Southern Women's History. This month, Professor Nunley will release her new book, The Demands of Justice, Enslaved Women, Capital Crime, and Clemency in Early Virginia, with the University of North Carolina Press. Our moderator, Shay Dawson, is the 2022-2024 NWHM U.S. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg Pre-Doctoral Fellow in Gender Studies, and is also a current Museum Studies graduate student at Johns Hopkins University. In the duration of her studies, she's on the Museum Education and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion program tracks. Professionally, she is interested in the ways museums and cultural heritage sites can facilitate community and foster empathy, as well as the function of archival documents as educational tools. We're really excited for this conversation today with Professor Nunley. And with that, I would like to welcome both Professor Nunley and Shay to the screen. Hi, ladies.
Hello. Thank you for having me. So we are so excited to be chatting with you today and to be able to share this space with you, to be able to talk about At the Threshold of Liberty. So Emma already said it, but thank you again for being here today. Very excited to dive in. I already just want to begin, I think, with a baseline question that kind of gets us talking about the foundations of this book, where these ideas came from for you. And so I'm initially very curious about what were the things, even maybe prior to writing this book or before it had become realized, that you were seeking to address that you knew needed to be explored on a larger scale? And that could be, different ideas or themes or moments in history and time that you felt like something like At the Threshold of Liberty could appropriately address.
So one of the questions that many of us are concerned with, particularly historians of the 19th century and the Civil War era, is once we get to the American Civil War, who is responsible for freeing the enslaved? And oftentimes that might lead to really important research on soldiers, the role of Union soldiers, the role of radical Republican legislators, President Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. And I thought this question was very interesting because at this time, particularly in DC, I started writing this last chapter of the book first before I began to research any other parts of the book. I was really steeped into the Civil War. And what was astonishing to me was just all the ways in which Black women began to leverage existing networks within the nation's capital to realize their freedom. And so once DC enacted emancipation, many of these enslaved women knew exactly where to go, knew where to secure their freedom. People who were coming from Maryland and from Virginia were also arriving to Washington, D.C. to make claims to freedom. And so in a lot of ways, there were many rehearsals of freedom that sort of unfolded in Washington, D.C. well before the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil War era. And so I began to sort of explore this question of how do Black women and girls realize visions of liberty that they had many years prior to the Emancipation Proclamation. And what you see is that they take a variety of routes to freedom, and that there are imaginings of freedom that start with them first, before it starts with the government, before it starts with sort of our political arena. There's a lot happening with the enslaved women and girls in the worlds they inhabit that get them thinking about freedom, and also help them and their actions really define what liberty looks like in the nation's capital. And so I had come to this research living in the area and wondering, wow, this is there's such a vibrant Black community and history in Washington, D.C. This is the chocolate city. And there are so many institutions, museums, churches, organizations that have been founded by Black people. How long does this history stretch back? And what you find is that many of those roots of institution building really take shape during the early republic.
Absolutely. It's interesting. I went to undergrad in Washington, D.C., and I just consistently found it to be a city where you would stumble upon the most interesting, rich history, and it might have just a small plaque. It's not even necessarily this large, expansive narrative. And so it's definitely a city where these things are extremely prominent. And I think without exploring them, or without having the foundation to know to explore them, you're not aware that these things are happening, or how beautiful these communities are and interconnected that they are. So I love that that's the question that you began this research with, because I think whether living in DC or just outside of DC, I think it is very much a city that allows for a lot of connection and community. And I think this book conveys that there's always been a history of that.
Yeah.
And so going off of that, I'm really curious about your thoughts and opinions on how being aware of this specific history in DC empowers Black people, both in DC and outside of DC. And I will also add the caveat, maybe to even expanding specifically on Black women. And I'm sure there's some interconnections there, but I think this is definitely a narrative that can be, and probably is, empowering to a lot of Black women.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, these women came of age at a time where slavery was thriving, the domestic slave trade was thriving, and DC played an important role in the domestic slave trade. And so when you see that level of racial repression happening and being sanctioned by the government, community, kinship ties, mutual aid all become absolutely essential to their survival over time. And so I think even thinking about contemporary connections and the ways in which these stories can empower our contemporary moment, there are ways in which the Black Lives Matter movement has highlighted that there's aspects of our criminal justice system or access to justice that are still limited, right, in terms of who gets to access it on an equal basis. And when you live in a society that has not yet realized some of the ideals and values that you want to see in it, your people, your community, those kinship ties become absolutely essential. And so what you find is that in DC in the early 19th century, there were no schools for Black children unless Black people created them, right? Or unless there were white allies who were willing to focus their energy and their finances to creating these schools. The government wasn't going to do that, despite the fact that Black residents paid taxes, right? And so when you see those deficiencies in society, it really becomes a matter of community in order to help sustain Black life. And so the work of bringing all of these enslaved women, free women, fugitive women, right, together, and everybody making their contribution, no matter how large or small, it collectively ends up creating something really pretty phenomenal, right? And that's where we begin to see those schools for Black girls, and we begin to see businesses and churches and institutions and organizations that that many people will access by the time we get to the Civil War, right? In terms of the organizations that are in existence that provide relief are going to be those organizations and institutions that were built by Black women.
Absolutely. And I think too, even in reading, it becomes apparent that there is a legacy of women who have come before us that are doing this work. And I think too, it's also very empowering to realize that there are commonalities between our circumstances and lived experiences, but that some of the luxuries that I experience are directly because of these women's perseverance and commitment to their communities. And I think
Yes.
that's something that I just, anytime I'm feeling a certain way about the certain climate or
Yes.
current climate, to be like, wow, there were really people that came before us that saw this and still said, I'm going to commit because of my love for my community. And I think it just consistently seems to come back to that.
Mhm.
And I think just remembering that is something I like to keep in my back pocket.
Yes,
Um, so
absolutely.
I see you have behind you the cover of the book. Yeah. So I wanted to maybe see if you were willing to get into, the woman on the cover, Elizabeth
Mhm.
Keckley, a little bit about her narrative and what essentially made her the prime candidate for being on the cover of the book.
Mhm. Well, Elizabeth Keckley is one of those people who really captures this idea that I refer to in the book called self-making. It's this idea that regardless of whether or not this legal status of enslaved or fugitive or whatever legal status that has been sort of a part of your destiny during this time doesn't exclusively define you, that there are aspects of creating and shaping, imagining an identity that transcends those legal categories. And I think Elizabeth Keckley really encapsulates that, right? That she was born enslaved, right? And became a really talented seamstress and was able to secure her own freedom through the talents of her sewing. And she leveraged that talent to build a name for herself in Washington, D.C. When she arrives to D.C., right? And she becomes a socialite, but she becomes an activist, an organizer, and an entrepreneur, creating dresses for some of the most prominent political wives of the nation's capital. And what's interesting is that she ends up becoming the fashion designer for Verena Davis, who is, the first lady of the Confederacy, but also
Wow.
Mary Todd Lincoln, who is the first lady of the Union, and she's able to navigate these elite worlds in really interesting ways that lead to her own economic sustainability, but in ways that also give her a political voice because of her proximity to the Lincoln household and the presidency. And she uses that to position herself as a really important leader for African Americans in DC. And so she does a lot of the work of organizing women, Black women, to help provide relief for enslaved people who are coming to Union lines during the American Civil War. And so you see this person who was born enslaved, but then has created this incredible persona that is centered around her gifts as a seamstress, as a fashion designer, but also as a political activist who is an important voice of her community. And so in that way, she becomes a really important figure for helping to understand this concept of self-making that runs throughout the book.
Absolutely. And how did you stumble upon her story? Was this just you began your research and came across her, or was there some other form of media that you had come across her narrative?
Well, Elizabeth Keckley, we're fortunate enough to have her autobiography. And so she wrote her own memoirs that were particularly focused on her life as an enslaved person, but also her relationship to the Lincoln presidency.
Awesome.
And it became a really popular and controversial memoir because of the kind of proximity she created between herself and Mary Todd Lincoln. And they were quite tight friends, right? But to be able to say that publicly in front of public readers and audiences was seen as controversial and misplaced even. And so we're fortunate in that her memoirs were popular enough that any student of the 19th century United States would have come across Keckley's autobiography and perhaps would have engaged with it for different reasons, whether it was to learn more about slavery in places like Virginia, North Carolina, or learn about dressmaking, or learn about the abolitionist cause, right, or the Civil War. And so that's how I came across her, was that she actually made herself available by creating
Wow.
this autobiography, and we're
Yeah,
really sort of fortunate to still have it.
absolutely. And I guess too, this relates to, asking you about how you came across her story, but were there other forms of media, books, movies, or even just your own lived experiences? We talked about what ideas you wanted to address in the book and why. But was there anything that you like consumed media wise or experience wise that especially made you like, okay, yeah, this book has to happen?
Well, I think what's interesting is that the Civil War is a really exciting field of study, and so many questions emerge from that body of literature, and that's how I started the book. But then I also became interested in questions such as once you become legally free, what then? What does your life look like after that, right? Do you become a prominent political activist and seamstress like Elizabeth Keckley? Do you become a school teacher or a church-going woman? Like many of our books that have been centered around African American achievement sort of focus on, or what really is available to you, right? What sustains your life, not only physically, but economically, right? How do you survive in a place where socially you are relegated to the bottom ranks of society and you have very narrow economic prospects? And so it had sort of those questions had forced me to look into other areas of the archive, such as criminal records and criminal court records, police precinct records. And what I found is that many enslaved women and free and fugitive women were trying to figure out how to survive economically. And so they were oftentimes policed for selling goods illegally without a permit, right? Or for engaging in sex and leisure economies, or they were in court for theft, right? And so there are sort of a range of records that I needed to consult in order to capture a more full story of what these women were doing in order to survive. And then a lot of abolitionist records remain a treasure trove for historians. And so William Still's Underground Railroad records are really important because they tell the stories of enslaved people running and escaping to free territories like Philadelphia and even further north to Canada. And then also looking at, the kinds of letters and documents that have already been combed through to tell the stories of presidents' wives, first ladies, right, and presidents in Washington, D.C., but with more of an eye toward the experiences of enslaved women and girls. And so those records were also super helpful.
Absolutely. Yeah, I talk often, in my introduction about archives as educational
Mhm.
resources. And I think it's really interesting to be able to have access to these oral histories or even other accounts, external accounts. And I think in the moment, in present day, oral histories, just talking about our narratives might seem to some like, oh, just basic. But, you look back on the things that we have access to now from many, many years ago. And it's like these things can be life-changing genuinely in terms of how we understand
Mhm.
current systems and past systems, and it's just one big cycle essentially. So that I think just affirms my belief that
Yeah.
archives are extremely, extremely important and having access to them even more so.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so another question for you.
Mhm.
You actually kind of touched on this a little bit earlier about my question about how knowing this history empowers Black women. But I would love to hear your thoughts on, these women having their own unique forms of resistance based on essentially their specific lived experience. And you talk about shifting identities. And so I think that's also a really fascinating concept because it's like you're living these many lifetimes in one lifetime.
Mhm.
And I'd be curious about your thoughts on modern legacies that stem from these women's realities and their narratives, and your thoughts on maybe present figures that uphold these same legacies or are doing similar work.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think, thinking about the fact that the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, right, are movements that are founded by Black women,
Yeah.
really already attest to sort of political traditions that don't always fall into sort of our more formal political technologies, right? Whether it be the courts or whether it be, thinking about political leadership, that there are so many sort of broader ways to imagine what civic engagement movement looks like and how you begin to sort of stretch ideas about justice, stretch ideas about equality. And so you see that with contemporary movements. Other sort of contemporary connections you see is around philanthropy, right? So I think about Oprah, like, the first Oprah is Alethea Browning Tanner in this book, right? Who was, formerly enslaved and had this amazing sort of entrepreneurial sensibility about her, and creates this garden plot, sells her goods at the center market, and becomes, actually pretty really well off economically, and is able to purchase the freedom of multiple family members. And after that, right, when you start to see the founding documents of some of the historic Black churches in DC, you see that she was actually on the donor rolls, right? Oftentimes one of the leading donors of some of these churches. She was an institution builder, right? And when they wanted to start new schools for Black children, she was also at the forefront of fundraising and ensuring that that these would be economically sustainable institutions for Black people, right? And so with that, you begin to see, right, these traditions of mutual aid, of kinship, and of movement building, grassroots organizing that is happening today on the ground. And that is really a part of a broader lineage of Black women's activism, right? And really beginning to sort of extend the reach of ideas like liberty, extending the reach of ideas like equality, extending the ideas of justice, right? And so they have played a role for many centuries, whether the government allowed them to or not, right? And so what you see is that the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th and 14th Amendments set in motion legally ideas that had already been sort of imagined and conceptualized among Black women and leaders in the Black community.
Yeah. That's great. I love your use of the word tradition as well. I think it's extremely fitting in the sense of, so one of my roles as a fellow with the museum is writing biographies. And a lot of these Black feminist narratives are so fascinating in the sense that a lot of these women are like, oh, I was just doing this work because, right? Like, because it not necessarily, it brought me joy, but aiding my community brought me joy, and being a part of a larger experience or a larger movement. Like, I wasn't doing this because I thought it was gonna make me, a recognized figure. I was doing it because it's what I was passionate about. And that's the through line through every single bio that I write. And so I say that to say, I think your use of the word tradition is just fitting, very, very fitting.
Black women are doers,
Truly.
By the time you get to the late 19th and early 20th century, which is out of the scope of this, beyond the scope of this book, but many Black women historians have covered this terrain beautifully. When you look at the Black women's clubs during the Progressive era, I mean, it is just, the work that they did is just enormous, right? All across the country, both at the local, state, regional, and national levels are organizing, and they're really trying to figure out how do we address the needs and the demands that are facing people within our communities. And everything from, we need a kindergarten, we need daycare so that people can go to work, right? We need to have a coat drive and a food drive because people need coats and food, right? And so it goes down to that, to all the way to fighting for the 19th Amendment, right? Fighting for equality and civil rights. And so there's just such a broad range of Black women's activism that we've only begun to touch the surface of.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, that also gets at the natural ways that we find community in one another. Even in these bios, a lot of these women know one another through just doing similar work. And I think that also really highlights how much of a space of connection doing this work ultimately ends up being for a lot of these women. And like you said, we see it time and time again. And so I say that to say, that's why tradition is just the absolute perfect word. It's almost like this innate thing, and we find each other through it. And so I guess, talking about that, are there any particular women that you talk about in the book? And I mean, you can also talk about women maybe outside of the book as well, if you'd like, whose stories that you find, even after publishing the book, still impact you in the work that you're doing. I know you mentioned another book coming out this year. So I'm really curious about if there's anything from this previous project that, or narratives from specific women that you feel like still are with you, and that heavily impact, what you write or how you talk about these stories?
I think just even the work of doing Black women's history in itself is one that I feel really privileged to be able to do. And so every story that I encounter is a treasure for me, is really something really special to be able to work with. I feel really fortunate to have encountered some of the women and girls in the story. And I'm always just really taken aback by their courage in moments where there is intense violence and surveillance, and even just great cause for hopelessness, that they still find ways to imagine something different, whether it be for themselves, whether it be for Black futures, whether it be for the United States. I'm also always really moved by a lot of the enslaved women who um, uh, escape DC to become free. And what's interesting about that is that most of the literature will correctly tell you that a lot of women don't escape at the same rates as Black men. Um, and a lot of that is definitely tied to kinship, definitely tied to a sense of place, and also with the duties and demands of child rearing and caring for other members of their families. And what I found interesting about DC is that because of DC's sort of relatively closer proximity to free states, that a lot of women actually did escape, and they escaped with their children in tow, oftentimes with infants, right? And so when you're trying to be discreet and to ensure that you're not going to be detected, and then to escape with an infant, anyone who's had an infant knows that this is really a high risk venture, right? And so I think in that sense, I'm always really just really humbled and in awe of those kinds of stories. I'm really in awe of the stories of women who make very, very little money compared to everybody else in society and manage to purchase their family members, which cost an enormous price. Right. And so just the lengths to which they go to realize their vision of liberty, whatever that might look like, to me, I think is just another tradition of imagining a different future and imagining a different way of living your life that has stemmed well into sort of the early 19th century and into today, right?
Yeah, definitely. I love your use of the term Black futures and, imagining a different future. And so, in talking about all these women, I think we've seen multiple examples of what they imagine the future to look like, not just, for their own families, but I think the Black community at large and potentially other Black women. And so I guess a personal question for you is, what do you imagine a better Black future to look like? What does producing works like this, what role does that play in what you imagine our future to look like, or what you hope our future looks like?
Oh gosh, that's such a big question. I mean, where do you begin? That's like a whole nother program.
Yeah, right. I guess, yeah.
Where
So,
do we begin?
take it a piece at a time.
I mean, I think that's the thing, right? Is that what we learned from these women is what we've always known, is that Black women have been at the forefront of chipping away at this nation's strengths and also deficiencies, right? They take a concept like liberty, which is something that is profoundly important to the nation's founding, and they stretch it and make it accessible, right? They imagine it being more accessible to everybody, right? As the people who are excluded from having access to liberty, right? They envision a nation in which they are free, right? In which they are is sort of having their own liberty realized, right? Same thing with justice, right? That justice becomes a hallmark of the legal scaffolding of this nation. But is it accessible to everybody? What does justice look like for everybody? And it's Black women who have been imagining and envisioning its reach beyond its sort of current moment and also in previous iterations, right? And so there are so many different ways where Black women are doing the hard work of chipping away at areas in this nation that continue to plague Black people continue to constrain the Black experience in really consequential ways. And so I think that collectively, Black women are doing the work, right? And you see its historical roots in the book.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I guess too, a question I had going off of that was, with the title At the Threshold of Liberty, what does liberty personally mean to you? And when do you personally feel that it's realized? And I guess a question kind of going off of that too, maybe even talking about different women within the book, maybe what their opinions were on when they know liberty is realized, or what that looks like for them or for their communities.
Right. I think it can mean different things to different people. I mean, I think to begin with, to be able to live without being policed, without being violated,
Yep.
right? To be able to access the same, legal protections as everybody else, right? But to live, right? And to live on one's own terms, I think is a basic level of freedom that these women are really organizing for and trying to realize. And oftentimes they end up having to break the law in order to do it, right? They end up having to violate what this nation considers to be right in order to get to reach a greater right, right? And so I think we're always pushing to realize what liberty looks like. Sometimes, one generation believes that liberty is accessing, the legal scaffolding to all the rights, right? But if on the ground we can't experience it, in our human day-to-day interactions, right? Where are the deficiencies? How can we continue to build on those legacies until we fully feel that we are full citizens with a full set of rights and attainable rights that we can really access. And so it's just such a loaded question, right? How to be free? What does liberty look like in the United States? Well, it really depends on who you're asking.
Definitely.
But not having to be afraid to have an interaction with a police officer, right, is one of many, right? When we look at the Black maternal death rates, right, to be able to give birth safely or to choose to not give birth, right? And so there are so many different areas. Where do you even begin, right? And so I think our work is still there's lots of work still ahead of us to begin to define what liberty really looks like here in the United States.
Definitely. And that's interesting that you say that too, because in reading, I feel like I'd love to hear your thoughts on areas that you feel like there could be further research, whether that you take on personally or that maybe someone else is inspired by your work and wants to take on. I guess just further areas that you think could be expanded upon, or that you think, somebody else with a different lived experience could maybe write further on. Yeah, I'll leave the question at that.
Yeah, I'll say this, in terms of my ethics around writing history, my intention is never to have the definitive say about any topic or any time period. This book is designed to create a conversation, and a conversation to which I hope that everyone participates in. And so my hope is that people will keep asking and probing questions of the past and ideas about liberty, and really capturing different experiences. I think that there are so many elements of this book that could be its own book, right? So each chapter is organized by a particular kind of encounter that a Black woman or girl might have in DC, whether it be in the courts, it could be with slavery, it could be with prostitution in the sex and leisure economy, it could be the Civil War, it could be schools. And I think each of those chapters could be their own book, right? Somebody can take each of those and run with it and really build upon it. And so I think every aspect of this book could be built upon and be developed further, and new questions can be generated, right? And once we feel like this question is no longer relevant, we can ask new questions. And so my hope is that it starts a conversation. I welcome, people who are interested in continuing this work, because it's so important, right? And we're again a part of a tradition, right? I didn't start this conversation. There were Black women before me who were writing about Black women's history, and so I sit on their shoulders, and I think there will be more to come, hopefully.
Yes, definitely. I think this is reminiscent to me of our conversation about Black futures of,
Yes.
I think, working in history, and I think envisioning a future where the legacy continues and that there are more Black women who are writing about these things and talking about these things and getting the conversation going. So I think that that's just very, very timely. Correct me if I'm wrong. You have slides that you wanted to show, right? Photos, I believe.
I think that there are photos available if we end up talking about certain people from the book.
Okay.
So,
I was gonna say, if you wanted to maybe jump into some of those slides, we could definitely do that.
okay. I don't have access to them,
Oh,
so.
gotcha. I think Emma's going to put them up for us.
Yes, yeah, we can see it. Yeah, so this is Jane Johnson who ends up escaping from her enslaver while she is in Philadelphia, I believe. Um, and what's interesting about her is that when she's in court, right, the court is trying to debate whether or not, right, she was unlawfully taken by abolitionists in the area, and she makes it very clear, I've always wanted to be free, right? And so this is like, I left of my own conviction. I've always wanted to be free. And I talk about just even her presentation of herself, her deportment, right? She's seen as a very elegant and poised woman who beautifully articulates her claim to freedom and her desire for freedom, despite the fact that she's coming from a place like DC that may have a big, right, free Black population. And oftentimes historians will treat places like that as being a place that is less hostile to African Americans because there are more free Black people. But a lot of these folks who live in DC say, that's not the issue. The issue is I want to be free. And so Jane Johnson provides a really powerful example of that. Right. And so here is an example of Ms. Weems here, who escapes leveraging William Steele's Underground Railroad network, but also you can tell that she is dressed in male attire. And so this was one of many strategies for escaping slavery, was to alter one's identity, whether it be gender identity or any other sort of ways of expressing oneself physically and presenting oneself sartorially. And so she's strategically able to leave by pretending to be, a boy who's a carriage driver. And this is Alethea Tanner, and this is a drawing of Alethea Tanner that is located in the Moreland Spingarn archives at Howard University, and just a really beautiful rendering of her. And she is who I refer to as the Oprah of her time. Someone who was very strategic financially in pulling together the resources necessary to free members of her family, but also to help finance institutions that are really important to Black DC. And these are drawings from the Matilda Minor School for Colored Girls. This was a school exclusively devoted to training up Black girls to become teachers of other Black schools, right? And so this is a strategy of really sort of building the networks and the resources necessary to build up literacy, Black literacy throughout the nation, right? Is this idea that we'll train up these classes of girls and they'll have access to all different kinds of knowledge, including geography, literature, theology, and science, and music, And they were sort of sending these drawings to their teacher when the teacher was away, trying to raise money for the school. I couldn't get this in the book because it wouldn't show up clear enough. And so this image to me was really, really important. And I think there's another one that might be on the slides. Yeah, there's another one of their drawings. And so it was just really neat to find this in the archive. This is in the Library of Congress. And then there's Keckley, and you can see sort of the full length photograph that is also from Howard University's archives. And you can just take note of the intricate dress, right? You know, it's not necessarily flashy, but you could tell it's very high quality, very intricate design, and also, you know, reflects a sensibility of modesty and in a lot of ways. But you can see the self-making happening in the dress, but also in her gaze.
Do you happen to know if any of the dresses that she has created are on display or on exhibit anywhere?
Yeah, I believe that the Smithsonian has some of her gowns. I think that Kent State University also has some of the things that she's sewn. So yes, she definitely has. Mary Todd Lincoln's gowns also at possibly at the Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum.
Very cool. Oh, cool. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I feel like the photos really solidify our discussion about tradition and legacy, and you know, there being a continued effort by these women. And I think the photos just really solidify. I'm a visual thinker, so I feel like that especially really helps. So I believe we are at time for our Q&A, and we have a couple questions from the audience. So if you're ready.
Yeah, so we've gotten a few questions from the audience, which I will start with. And just to say again, Professor Nunley, thank you so much for sharing your book with us and your research with us, and these stories, and Shay for doing such a wonderful job of moderating the conversation thus far. So I guess kind of related to the book as a whole, Professor Nunley, one of our audience members was hoping that you could speak to the emotional experience that you had while researching and writing your book, and basically how did you manage all of that?
This is a question that I'm always glad that I get. It's almost an acknowledgement of, okay, this had to be very challenging because it's what a lot of folks term hard histories, right? This, particularly when you're talking about slavery and when you're talking about also the ways in which society relegates Black women to poverty, right, and to scarcity. And so there are lots of hardships that these Black women and girls face throughout the course of the book. And, you know, what I try to do is I try to commit to telling the story is the best way that I can with the tools that I have as a historian. And so one emotional response is to try to do right by what I'm reading and what I am seeing and hearing in the text. And then the other thing is to engage with other people who are doing this work, right? And so I think that sometimes writing history can really be isolating enterprise, right? And so just finding community in the same spirit in which we see these women doing the same thing is really essential. And so being surrounded by other scholars who are committed to doing this work has been really essential for me. And then another kind of emotional response is doing events like this so that I could, you know, kind of put these ideas out there and get a sense to, you know, a chance to hear from you all about what you think about it, right? And so just creating sort of a public forum to engage with this work. And so I think the goal here is to not be alone, right? To not sit alone with it, but to really allow these stories to connect us.
Well, we certainly appreciate that you are sharing these stories with us. And related kind of to this question about the writing of the book, Was there anything left out of the book, like the pictures from minor school, that you wish hadn't ended up on the cutting room floor?
No, you know what? I think, the press was really great in allowing me to put as much as I could in there, to tell the most robust story that I could. One of those chapters is the sex and leisure economies chapter, right? Oftentimes, a lot of histories are written with a sense of linear progression or with a sense of, a focus on achievements or what's most evident in the record. But the fact of the matter is that the sex and leisure economy is not some marginal, like hidden, sort of it's sort of reality in the 19th century. The sex and leisure economy is actually quite prominent and important. And a lot of women end up engaging with the sex and leisure economy either on a temporary basis or on a long-term basis, right? And so I think there's a way in which writing this kind of book, about how Black women have overcome and really transcended the odds, could lend itself to excluding that chapter. And I thought it was really important to include it and talk about the very narrow prospects available to Black women under the context of legal freedom. And then the drawings, I mean, it just hurt my heart. I mean, I'm a pretty agreeable person when it comes to working with editors and, working with presses, but there was just no way to make that image sharp enough for it to show up well in the book. And so that really broke my heart because it was, it was from the little Black girls who were in the school, and it was the thing that I had that was from them. And so that definitely was a difficult decision because we wanted everybody to be able to access it, and in terms of being able to see it clearly.
Yeah, it's always hard when you have to print kind of in black and white and an
Yeah.
image is, you want to capture the color and the contrast of the images. So I guess related to, while we're on the subject of the minor school, so you actually open your book with the quote, "I have thought though men enslave the body, they cannot enslave the mind and prevent it from thinking," which is a quote from Mary Brent, who was a student at
Mhm.
Attila Minor School for Colored Girls. So could you talk a little bit about why you chose to open the book with that quote?
Yeah, I think to see Mary Brent's determination to become educated, to gain literacy, to expose herself to different forms of study through school, really was, to me, quite a profound expression of self-making. And what I think is interesting is I pair it with a quote from Jefferson about liberty, right? And so here you have two different ideas about liberty. They're actually not all that different. They're similar. They're from people who occupy very different places in American society. And what I wanted to show is that Black women and girls, right, which I think is important to state, were envisioning liberty, defining it, and expanding its reach and its scope in so many different ways. And here was an example, a concrete example of that.
That's wonderful. Do you know what happened to Mary Brent, where her story goes after the minor school?
I'm not sure if it's Mary Brent, but I know that there are other students that I mentioned in the book who end up becoming teachers and starting their own schools. And so the idea was that they would come into the school and then they would now become sort of anti-slavery activists and leaders in their own community. And so they would, in rented rooms, right, in apartments, start their own schoolroom, right? And so that was sort of the expectation of the girls, but I wasn't always able to trace every girl that came out of the minor school. But some ended up sort of later in the census as teachers by the late 19th century, which was pretty fascinating.
That's amazing. And it also goes kind of towards the discussion that you and Shay were having earlier about, the importance of the archives and the
Mhm.
importance of what doesn't make it into the archive. Those silences are sometimes just as telling as what we can actually go back and read. So a couple more questions from the audience. So Jean would like to know how, when, and why did the Black 400 elite rise in Washington, D.C.?
You know, one of the things that I was living in the DC area at the time, and what became evident to me was this thriving Black middle class. And this Black middle class that if you ever spoke to any member of that class will tell you, my family's been here, you know, since the 19th century. And so what I found that to be true, right? Is that there are certain families that are in the book where you can locate those same last names today, as being really important leaders, in DC, Black leaders in DC and all over the country, right? And so in a lot of ways, because places like DC had, you know, vibrant free Black population, that had established roots, established their own institutions. Those institutions that they established were essential to sustaining an upwardly mobile Black population, right? Giving people access to education, right? To communities and to community resources through churches, and support and mutual aid, right? Through certain activist organizations. And so it's that institution building that was done during the early Republic that helped to sustain many African American families and communities in a direction of upward mobility, by the time we get to the late 19th and early 20th century.
Thank you for that question. So maybe I think we have time for about one more question. I apologize, I'm not going to get to everything in the Q&A, but National Women's History Museum, so I got to ask a museum-related question. But if you had to design an exhibit based on this book, what objects and what stories would you want to include in that exhibition?
Well, definitely the girls' drawings, right? So if I can't have it in the book, it has to be in the exhibit, right? So I would definitely include the drawings. I would include definitely one of Keckley's dresses, which I think is super important. And then I would also include some court records from Black families who are petitioning for their freedom, in DC. And then I would also put court records and criminal precinct records, from people who were getting in trouble for trying to survive and trying to live free. And so I think I would mine a lot of the sources that I actually had a chance to look at, in order to tell this story. And you would just find that it was a really fascinating story. There's also some archaeological objects that were dug up under Mary Hall's prostitution parlor. And so I might include some of those things too, you know, because I think it tells a really interesting story about the hierarchy of sex and leisure work.
Well, thank you so much. That sounds like a really exciting exhibit. So maybe one of these days we'll get to see it in real life or in virtual space. But we are almost at time. So I just want to say to both Professor Nunley and to Shay, thank you so much for being with us today and walking us through this fascinating history, having this wonderful conversation about this incredibly important topic of early Black women's activism and organizing in DC, and also helping us gear up for our first exhibit, which is opening at the end of the month, which kind of jumps off Professor Nunley from your book. So again, if you are interested in learning more about Professor Nunley, you can go to her website, either on Cornell's page or her own, and please check out her book from UNC Press. It is a wonderful, wonderful read. We are getting applauses from the audience in the Q&A. But to our audience today, thank you so much for joining us. We hope that you can join us for other programs, not only during Women's History Month, but moving forward throughout the year. You can find a list of all of our upcoming events and registration links on our website at www.womenshistory.org. So again, Professor Nunley, Shay, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been wonderful, and I hope that everyone has a good rest of their weekend and they stay healthy and safe. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.